Welcome back, class. Let's review real quickly our last session. We addressed Ivan Sechenov, who wanted to explain all psychic phenomena on the basis of associationism and materialism. Ivan Pavlov proposed classical conditioning. Vladimir Bekarev focused on overt behavior of organisms. And also John Watson, a major proponent of objective psychology. He also wrote the Behaviorist Manifesto, basically communicating the idea it's all about behavior. William Dougal, who offered another aspect of behaviorism by stating that mental aspects can be studied indirectly. And then Guthrie, where he communicated such ideas as movements and acts. A movement, a specific response to a configuration of stimuli in which an association is learned at full strength after one exposure, and acts made up of movements, and a skill is made up of acts. So where we left off last class was talking about Guthrie. We'll continue that. Guthrie also had ideas about forgetting occurs in one trial due to an old SR stimulus response association being displaced by a new one. Also about breaking habits consists of observing the stimuli which elicit the habitual behavior and performing other behavior in the presence of those stimuli, and also thought about the effectiveness of punishment, determined not by the pain it causes but by what it causes the organism to do in the presence of the stimuli that elicit the undesirable behavior. If punishment elicits behavior incompatible with the undesirable behavior in the presence of these stimuli, it will be effective. Then drives, provided maintaining stimuli that keep an organism active until a goal is reached. These can be internal or external. Attempts were made to formalize the theory and thus make it more testable. Vivian Vokes and William Estes attempted to formalize the theory and thus make it more testable here. Now, this idea about drives, another one, another interesting individual, Clark Leonard Hull, the hypothetico-deductive theory of learning. Three important concepts included reinforcement, habit strength, and reaction potential. Influence on all the amount of research it produced in methodology, used intervening variables as Tolman did, and we'll see about Tolman in a few seconds here, but used them more extensively. Hull's intervening variables were primarily physiological, in contrast to the cognitive variables we'll see of Tolman. These three important concepts that Hull proposed were reinforcement. A biological need creates a drive, and the decreasing of that drive constitutes reinforcement, thus a drive reduction theory of reinforcement. So as the drive goes away, you're feeling better, and therefore that serves as a reinforcement for the behavior. Habit strength. If a response leads to a drive reduction, habit strength is increased. Operationally defined, habit strength is the number of reinforced pairings between an environmental situation and a response. An increase in habit strength constitutes learning. And then reaction potential. The probability that a learned response will occur. It is primarily a function of the amount of drive and habit strength, but is also influenced by other intervening variables. So the influence on the amount of research it produced in methodology, the whole theory has essentially gone away. Its great influence was the amount of research it produced as researchers devised projects to test the theory's predictions and validity. Now we talk about B.F. Skinner. Skinner essentially was from the Francis Bacon and to a lesser extent from Ernst Mach school. Basically, scientists were to collect empirical facts and then infer knowledge from those facts, not devise theories and then deduce facts from theory. Science is to be descriptive and inductive rather than theoretical and deductive. So let's talk about functional analysis of behavior. An analysis of the relationships between environmental events and behavioral events. Internal events have no place in such an analysis because they are events also and thus need to be explained also. So internal events cannot serve as explanations or causes of behavior from this perspective. Now, according to Skinner, there were two types of behavior. Respondent behavior was behavior which was related to environmental stimuli that is reflexive behavior, basically classical conditioning or Pavlovian conditioning. And operant behavior is behavior that is influenced by its consequences, and because it operates on the environment in such a way as to produce consequences, he called this behavior operant behavior. Operant conditioning takes place as the behavior of the organism is affected by its consequences. So the organism does something, and because of what they did, there's going to be a consequence for that behavior. And therefore, in the future, that behavior will be dictated to some extent by what those consequences actually were. Now, reinforcement is the process by which a consequence of a behavior increases the rate or probability of the behavior. Nothing else is necessary to define reinforcement. The reinforcement can mean anything as long as its effect is to increase the probability of the behavior that produced the consequence. You may have heard, if you've ever had to deal with young children, particularly at a school, in a classroom, for example, you may have heard the adage that sometimes when a kid misbehaves, you should try to ignore the behavior. Do not respond or act to it. The idea is this: for some kids, when they act out and they're going to get yelled at by their teacher or disciplined in some way, any type of attention whatsoever may serve as a reinforcement. So even if you yell at the student or chastise them or punish them in some way, that may serve as a reinforcement. Therefore, the behavior will continue. So when they tell you to ignore the behavior, they're basically saying trying to deny the reinforcement for it. So again, remember this: the process of consequence of behavior increases the rate of probability of behavior. Nothing else is necessary to define reinforcement. The reinforcer can be anything as long as its effect is to increase the probability of that behavior. Reinforcement contingencies influence which behaviors are increased and which are not. Change contingencies and you can change behavior. Selection of behavior by consequences. Darwinian ideas can be applied here. The organism produces a variety of behaviors. Some will result in consequences that will increase the behavior, will be functional and reinforcing. These effective behaviors will be selected to be part of the organism's repertoire, while others will not. And in a way, the notion is this: if you learn that behavior aids you in surviving, allowing you to live longer, to have offspring, and so on and so forth. So the idea here is that reinforcement is a powerful aspect of the Skinnerian philosophy of how psychology works and how we learn. So reinforcement versus punishment of behavior. Reinforcement of behavior exerted a much better control over behavior than punishment of behavior. Skinner's opposition was not non-theoretical. Operationism is important, but he rejected the theoretical aspects of logical positivism, was content to manipulate environmental events and observe the effects on behavior, the functional analysis. His approach was called descriptive behaviorism, so he did not want to take it too far. The idea here is that he wanted to see the behavior and the impact of that behavior, not try to go take it beyond what was basically just being seen. He just described what happened. So in behavior analysis, Skinner and other behavior analysts have always sought to apply operant principles to solve practical problems. This gave birth to the applied behavior analysis. It provided behavioral technology to change behavior in multitudes of settings. The most prominent area is the application of behavioral principles to helping people in educational settings, with problems ranging from psychosis, drug addiction, mental retardation and learning disabilities, speech disorders, shyness, phobias, and juvenile delinquency. Now let's discuss Tolman. He studied purposive in molar behavior. Studied purposive behavior in contrast to molecular behavior that he saw with Watson. At Harvard, Tolman learned to study purposive aspects of behavior without sacrificing scientific objectivity, done by seeing purpose in the behavior itself rather by inferring purpose from the behavior. He called purposive behavior molar behavior in contrast to molecular behavior of Watson. Molar is that behavior cannot be understood by focusing on the events in the moment. Rats used to avoid introspection. He wanted to use something that did not have the ability to have this introspection ideas. Tolman saw the use of rats as experimental subjects as a way of guarding against even the possibility of indirect introspection that could occur if humans were used as experimental participants. Now, key idea. Tolman offered up this idea of intervening variables. Variables that intervene between the environmental event and the behavior. Okay? Tolman's intervening variables were cognitive processes which are influential in determining behavior. Among those variables that intervene between experience and behavior are going to be things like hypotheses, expectations, beliefs, a cognitive map. So the notion here is that he did not want to go away from things that we could not see objectively. So Tolman was bringing back the notion of something intervening between the behaviors, some environmental event, and then some behavior that's done. There has to be something in between there. And what he referred to as intervening variables describes what that thing is. So Tolman disagreed with Watson and Thorndike's explanation of learning. He believed that learning occurs constantly with or without reinforcement and with or without motivation. The distinction between learning and performance. Learning takes place constantly as the organism interacts with the environment. Meaning you can learn something and not even intend to. You just do. Whether the organism uses what it has learned is determined by its motivational state. In other words, whether the organism performs the learned behavior is based on whether it is motivated to do so. Performance is the translation of learning into behavior. So you may learn something, but you may not have the occasion to demonstrate that learning until certain things may motivate you to do so. This is latent learning. Tolman and Hanzik, 1930, showed that learning remained latent until the organism had a reason to use it, which was an incentive. So that sets the stage for what we'll see after this, looking at cognitive psychology. But we need to go ahead and discuss real briefly here the impact of behaviorism today. So we've seen a variety of individuals. We saw the Russian objective psychologists like Pavlov and Bekarev and Sakhanov. We saw John Watson. We saw B.F. Skinner. All these individuals sort of set the stage for this major movement, this wave that would happen in the Americas of behaviorism during this time frame. It became one of the predominant areas of psychology, the main focus of study and things of that nature. Remember from your general psych classes that around this same time, we had other psychology that was somewhat prominent as well. The European psychology of Freud, the psychodynamic perspective and school of thought. That was very prominent as well. And then now we have behaviorism on top of that. Now, what this set the stage up for is the humanist movement, as you recall. The behaviorists were saying basically behavior can be controlled if you can control the consequences or the stimuli. And the psychodynamic school of thought from Freud were saying we're driven and our behavior is modified by our unconscious. So a lot of things were taken out of control. And that's why there was a reaction to this. And this is where the humanist movement came up, led by Abraham Maslow and Carl Rogers. But behaviorism is still around today. It still has a great deal of influence on how things exist in psychology today. Skinner remains the most influential of all the behaviorists. As evidence of his influence in a survey in 1991 of historians of psychology and chairpersons of graduate programs in psychology, they were asked to rank the most important psychologists of all time and the 10 most important contemporary psychologists. And on the all-time list, historians Wundt and Skinner, Wundt the first and Skinner the eighth, according to this. All right, so depending on contemporary psychology, it may change a little bit. But the idea Skinner with contemporary psychologists were seen as number one by both groups. All right. So behavior analysis today even is responding to current challenges. This is not to say there are not challenges to behavioral themes and ideas. Today, many of the principles and the ideas of behaviorism are being challenged in behavior analysis and is responding. So the idea is that behaviorism still has a significant place in today's world